Good morning and welcome to the Research 101 series. My name is Enrica Ziller, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research at the University of Texas at Dallas. As we move through today's session, I invite you to post questions into the chat for our guest speakers to discuss. Here to present Single IRB Review for Multisite Research is Amanda Boone, Director of the Institutional Review Board at UT Dallas and a member of her team, Mary Beth Goodnight. Amanda and Mary Beth, welcome.
Thank you, Enrica. Today we're going to be talking about Single IRB. We will discuss the following things that are on the screen right now. We'll discuss defining Single IRB. We'll be talking about what exactly it is, how it's defined, all of that fun stuff. You'll be able to determine when Single IRB is needed, when it's appropriate, and when maybe it doesn't really apply to your study. And then we'll talk about the different components of the Single IRB. You've got a relying institution, and you've also got the reviewing institution as well. We'll define kind of what those roles are between those two institutions, what's expected, all of that fun stuff. And we'll also talk about the requirements for approval. And that's going to be specific to UT Dallas because, as we all know, all IRBs are a little bit different. So first, what I'm going to talk about is just the basics. Single IRB, federally funded studies is when it really kind of kicks in. And we'll talk about a little bit more on a following slide. But when you have federally funded studies that involve human subjects research, and that human subjects research goes across different institutions, then the Single IRB is going to be a requirement. We have one of the IRB sites is going to serve as the IRB of record. It's going to just kind of take over the oversight of the human subjects parts of the study to make sure that everything's in compliance with regulations and all of that stuff. It's really going to focus and be, if it was just UT Dallas researchers and UT Dallas institution alone, the IRB of record is going to be just the same as UT Dallas is when we're reviewing our own studies here as the IRB of record. There are the two different components. You have the Reviewing IRB, which is the IRB of record. This, like I kind of said before, it accepts the responsibility of the research oversight, the compliance aspect when it comes to human subjects protection. And then you have the Relying IRB. And this doesn't have to be just one institution. It can be multiple institutions. If there are three institutions on a study, you will have one Reviewing IRB, one IRB of record, and then you would have the other two institutions being the Relying IRBs. And they really just, those institutions just come to this agreement. We are okay with another institution taking on that oversight. We will relinquish our oversight of the study and allow the IRB of record to do so, and we will comply with their requirements and all of that kind of stuff. So there are two different federal arms, I guess you would call that, of when Single IRB is required. Two different types. You have the HHS, which is really kind of what the main regulations that UT Dallas human subjects research kind of fall under. We have HHS, we have FDA, are the two main federal regulations. In HHS, in 2018, we had a update to the regulations that kind of had been in place for many years. They updated those, and one of those updates was the Single IRB. And so as part of the regulations, all cooperative multi-study research, that included human subjects research, needed to be part of this Single IRB. Institutions located in the US. That's another requirement for when it falls underneath the HHS regulation requirements. And this was effective January the 21st, 2020. As I said, the regulations changed in 2018, but we kind of had a delay in when the effective date of the single IRB component of that regulation. They wanted to kind of give institutions time to figure out how to incorporate and put the systems in place to actually let this be allowable so that they could do it effectively. On the other hand, you have NIH, who didn't give us that window. Theirs was effective January the 25th of 2018. So if you had a study that was submitted, a proposal that was submitted to the NIH, that was submitted before January the 25th, on or before January 25th, 2018, then the NIH single IRB requirement kind of kicked in. I think they did kind of give us a little bit of time before they really made it a requirement, but in all, most instances, it was effective pretty much January the 25th, 2018. So those aren't going to be for those NIH-funded studies, of course, because it is NIH, the institution. And of course, the main difference between the HHS and the NIH is going to be the NIH says that if there are multi-institutions and they're doing the same protocol, they're doing the same type of activities. We have UT Dallas, who's doing the same activities as the University of Florida. When it comes to that human subjects research, it's the same protocol, then that's when the single IRB is going to kick in. That's the main difference between these two. So I do have a couple of examples that I'm going to kind of run through, and I will read through them and kind of give a little bit of time so that you can kind of determine whether or not you think single IRB applies based on what we've kind of talked about already. So the first example is UT Dallas PI recruiting stroke patients from UT Southwestern clinics to evaluate the effects of TDCS on memory. And TCDS is kind of a brain stimulation. The study involves this brain stimulation procedure, this TDCS procedure in the PI's lab, as well as behavioral tests and MRI scans at the Brain Health Imaging Center here at UT Dallas. Data will not be shared with UT Southwestern. So let's think about this for a little bit. When we're thinking about HHS, when we're thinking about NIH, would this be a study that needs to have single IRB? When we're looking at this specific study, it doesn't say anything about funding, but let's say that it was funded, even if it wasn't funded. This is not a multi-site study, as UT Southwestern is really not engaged in the research activity. So when we're talking about engagement, that is that they're not really involved in the actual human subjects research part of the study. So you have UT Dallas doing all of the procedures, collecting all of the data, analyzing all of the data, all of that stuff. The only real activity that's taking place at UT Southwestern is that recruitment activity. And the individuals at UT Southwestern who are the activity that's going on in their clinics, they're not engaged in the research, they're not involved, they're not investigators on the study or anything else. They're just allowing UT Dallas investigators to come into their clinics and recruit patients from their clinic. So this would not be an instance where single IRB would be required. And I know all of you got that right. So here's example 2. We have a funded study on the relationship of sugar intake and depression. UTD, University of Arizona, and Kansas State University will each have a principal investigator who will be in charge of recruiting, consenting participants, and collecting data on sugar intake, medical history, and depression. The data from each institution will be sent to the UTD PI for analysis. A sub-award will be signed with each institution to cover study expenses. would this need to be a single IRB? And while it says it's a funded study, it doesn't say who. So let's say this was funded by the Department of Education. So when we're looking at the different rules, the HHS, NIH, this is considered a multi-site study, and it will require single IRB. Each institution is engaged in conducting the research protocol. So yes, it would definitely need to be a single IRB. So here's example 3. NIH-funded studies, it is the effects of smoking on dental implants. UT Southwestern principal investigator will send extracted dental implants to UTD-PI. UTD analyzes the chemical composition of the implants and returns the results to UT Southwestern. Would this be a single IRB? The answer is, while there are 2 sites engaged in the project, this is not a multi-site study as defined by the NIH, because each site is conducting a different part of the research activity. So because it is funded by NIH, and each site is doing a different part of the study, you've got Southwestern, who is actually extracting the dental implants. You've got UT Dallas, who is analyzing those implants, getting the chemical composition for that. They might be returning the results to UT Southwestern, but no part of the UT Dallas part and the UT Southwestern part really intersect. So they are doing different activities in the research project. So by NIH standards, and the NIH rule, single IRB would not be required for this particular study. So why? Why do we have to do single IRB in the first place? When the common rule was, when updates were made to the IRB regulations, one of the things that the people wanted was to eliminate the administrative burden for those investigators. There was a lot of talk about why do we have dual effort? It's the same study, it's the same human subjects project. Why do we need to have every single institution going through their IRB? And it might not seem like it makes a whole lot of difference if you've got 2 institutions that are kind of working on the same study. And a lot of UT Dallas studies, there's going to be, most typical, it's going to be 2 institutions working together. We do have some that are 3 institutions and some that may be even 4 that are working together. And so as you get more and more institutions, you can see how it makes more sense the more institutions that you get on, how much longer it could be drug out if you have 4 institutions having to go through their IRB project, IRB process versus 2. When you're talking about some of the medical institutions that are doing clinical studies across the United States, you could potentially get, 50 institutions on a study, if not more. I know that I recently saw a clinical study that had 100 institutions throughout the United States. So you could potentially have a lot of administrative burden put onto the investigators. You have a lot of stalling going on because, institution A has gone through their IRB process, it's approved, but institution B has not gotten that approval. Institution C, there's some sort of issue. It's not really clear what's going on there. And so it's really hard for those institutions to kind of collaborate on this study and do it cohesively. So that was one. I wanted to simplify the review process, make it more efficient, get more timely approvals, all of that thing. If you have one consent form that's approved for everybody, then that's more cohesive than if you have 50 different types, 50 different approved consent forms. So every participant of the study is not getting the same information, all of that stuff. So this is why we go with the single IRB. Please note that while you have different roles, the IRBs have different roles of the institutions. Like you have the reviewing IRB, you have the relying IRBs. Just because your institution's IRB is not the IRB of record doesn't mean that there are not some sort of oversight responsibilities on your institution, even if you are just the relying institution. Each institution, each PI is responsible for the conduct of their study, and each institution really is responsible for making sure that the research that's being done on their institution, on their campus, with their employees, their students, is being done in an ethical and in an ethical manner, and one that is compliant with regulations and laws and all of that stuff. So just because you have a study, UT Southwestern is the IRB of record, it doesn't mean that somebody from our IRB office wouldn't come over and ask to do a post-monitoring check or those types of things. It doesn't mean that you don't have reporting responsibilities to our office, those types of things. So how is it determined who will be the reviewing IRB, who will be the relying IRB? How does this whole thing play out? Hopefully it's behind the scenes. Hopefully the investigators don't have a whole lot of involvement in this, because it really is between the institutions. A lot of the times it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. So there's no real written black and white, this is when, a lot of it mirrors a lot of IRB regulations in and of itself. It depends. So some of the things that we're going to be looking at we're going to be looking at the study itself, what is actually taking place, and the risk to participants. Which institution does it make the most sense would review this? If we're doing a joint study with UT Southwestern and there are actual implants being implanted, there's surgery involved, there's medication that's being prescribed to participants, it would make sense for UT Southwestern to be the IRB of record, because their IRB is familiar with that type of research, more familiar with that type of research, and their IRB is more experienced in that type of review for their IRB. So that would make sense in that case. If you look at the institutions involved versus the research activity at each site, maybe you don't have medical procedures or anything like that, but maybe 90% of the research is being done at UT Southwestern, and you have 10% being done at UT Dallas, that type of thing. You're looking at the experience of the study teams. If you have a relatively inexperienced study team at Southwestern and you have individuals and investigators at UT Dallas who are very experienced, then you're going to maybe want to lean towards the lab group, the principal investigators that might be a little bit more seasoned in the procedures and human subjects research period. You want to look at resources available, and then you want to look at the lead institution of the federal grant. All of these things are going to be things that are weighed. The IRB office at UT Dallas is going to be in contact with the IRB offices at the other institutions, and we're going to have that discussion, and we're going to come into some agreement. There are some instances where the federal sponsor will say, and this would be documented either in some sort of correspondence or in the actual approval documentation, where it would say UT Southwestern will serve as the IRB of record. Sometimes, and it depends on the sponsor, it depends on how the proposal was submitted. Maybe it was submitted that UT Dallas would be the IRB of record, and maybe that's part of what the sponsor, part of how they made the determination that they would fund the study. I don't know, but sometimes that would play into it as well. There are some exceptions, of course. There's always going to be exceptions to a rule. Single IRB is not required if you have exempt studies. So if there are studies that are deemed to be or determined to be exempt, then we're not going to go through the single IRB. We will still have some sort of process. So if you are working on a study, it's deemed to be exempt, or you think it's exempt, we would still want to have some sort of application coming into our office so that we can say, yes, it is officially ruled as exempt. Other institutions would more likely have that same process. Sometimes it's just a written correspondence, but there's usually some sort of process that says, yes, this is exempt, you don't have to come through us. And the regulations don't. If it's exempt from the regulations, they're not going to look for that either. If you have foreign sites, if we have UT Dallas, who is working with somebody in Ireland, institution in Ireland, single IRB isn't going to be required for that. If you have UT Dallas, UT Southwestern, and somebody over in Ireland, you're going to have single IRB for that part of the study that's being conducted in the United States. So the UT Dallas and the UT Southwestern, single IRB, and then that Irish institution, they have their own review process, which they need to be able to go through. So that single IRB doesn't apply in that instance. If you have a policy of an institution or of an institution, such as the VA, the Veterans Affairs, they're not going to have a single IRB. It's part of their policy. It's prohibited. So in that instance, there's that exception. If there is a something like that, then of course that's where you can come into the exception. And then if the federal department or the federal agency that's funding the study says, yeah, we're not going to do it, doesn't make sense, and they document that in some way, then it's not required. And please note, I think I kind of talked about this, that the study, multiple sites must comply. And there can be some sites like that example that I gave of UT Dallas and UT Southwestern with the Irish. You have the two in the United States that are required to do that single IRB, whereas the Irish institution is kind of allowed to have their own review process as well. So when I say that the institutions come to agreement on their own, of course, we're going to have to sign some sort of document because that's how we do it with everything. We're going to want to really make sure that the terms are really spelled out and specific, and that there are no questions as to who's going to do what and who's responsible for what and all of that fun stuff. We want to just make sure that the arrangement is really clear. So that's what we're going to do. Our IRB office is going to contact the other institution's IRB office. We're going to have that conversation. Who's going to rely on whom? Who's going to be the IRB of record? Let's sign an agreement to do so. It really says if UT Dallas is going to rely, it says we relinquish our right to be that IRB of record, and we acknowledge you as that oversight authority. When you are, and Mary Beth will talk about this in more detail later, but if you are doing a IRB protocol and another institution is going to be the IRB of record, UT Dallas is going to be the relying institution, it still does require some sort of process through our office. We still want to have documentation. We still want to have knowledge of that study because there are individuals who are affiliated with UT Dallas who are engaged in human subjects activities. So we're going to want to have record of that. We're going to want to know exactly what activities are being done here at UT Dallas and all of that fun stuff. So there is a submission application submission that can be submitted through Cayuse, and so that we would ask you to do that. And Mary Beth, again, we'll talk about this in greater detail. There are many different types of reliance agreements. There's many ways to say the same thing. We talk about contracts, non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. There's 1,000 ways to do any type of contract. And the same is true with single IRB, with IRB reliance. So we have the IRB authorization. We also call that a reliance agreement. We have the Smart IRB, which is a, this was kind of, Smart IRB is, let's say it's like a group or a club, but it's just a system that each institution, if they want to join Smart IRB, here's the master terms. You're okay with these master terms. We're going to sign this agreement, and everybody who has signed this agreement then can go through the Smart IRB portal. You're just signing these really short one-page things, or you're going through the portal and doing it electronically. Either way, you can go. But the master terms of that Smart IRB are going to be in effect for all of those studies. We are a member of Smart IRB, so we can do it online, or we can just use their paper form and do it that way. And then we have the UT System Master Reliance Agreement. All of the UT System schools, I would say, except for some of the larger medical institutions, are using the UT System Master Agreement. I say the larger schools, UT Southwestern is one of them that does not use the UT System Master Agreement. We go through Smart IRB for them. That's the way they prefer it. And it makes sense just for their clientele and who they collaborate with on a daily basis. But we do have that. All the sister schools, except for UT Southwestern and I think the health science centers, are part of that. There are also other institutions within Texas who have signed that are not part of UT System that are part of that. We have master terms, and just like the Smart IRB, we have a little addendum that we can sign and then say, yes, the UT System master terms are really what's going to apply here. I think this is where I kick it over to Mary Beth.
Thank you, Amanda. Now we're going to discuss UTD Serving as the Reviewing IRB. The UTD IRB will serve as the Reviewing IRB for an offsite location when the offsite location is engaged in human subjects research. Engaged in the research means those individuals are interacting with participants or analyzing the data. When the IRB serves as the Reviewing IRB, when the UTD IRB serves as the Reviewing IRB, it is accepting the responsibility of research oversight for a particular study. The IRB office, the Associate Vice President for Research and/or the institutional official will make the final determination regarding if UTD will serve as the Reviewing IRB for an offsite location. As Amanda mentioned earlier, there could be situations where UTD serving as the IRB of record would not make sense, such as medical studies in collaboration with a medical institution. The conditions for the UTD IRB to serve as the Reviewing IRB: the research shall be conducted in collaboration with UTD. So UTD needs to be involved in the research in order for us to serve as the IRB of record. The UTD investigator has a formal affiliation with UTD and will be conducting research at the offsite institution or location. A formal affiliation would be a UTD faculty, staff, or student. The performance site engaged in human subjects research may or may not have an IRB, but they have agreed to rely on UTD IRB for review of a specific research project. In general, the relying institution is not an international site. The UTD investigator needs to provide all necessary information related to the research activities conducted at the offsite location in the UTD IRB application. So that IRB application submitted to our office needs to include all of the research conducted at UTD and at the unaffiliated sites. It's the responsibility of the UTD investigator to submit copies of the UTD IRB approved study materials to the relying IRB per their requirements. Each institution is different, so you'll need to check with that IRB to determine what information they need and when they need that. The relying IRB is required to maintain documentation of IRB or human subjects protection training, conflict of interest disclosures, etc. for their study personnel, and this should be made available to UTD IRB upon request. So it's the responsibility of the relying institution to ensure that their personnel are qualified to conduct the research. We don't always require this documentation, but it should be available upon request. It is the responsibility of the relying IRB to communicate any findings or problems associated with the conduct of the research to the UTD IRB in a timely manner when we serve as the IRB of record or the reviewing IRB. Examples could include unanticipated problems involving risks to participants or others, complaints from research participants, or any serious or continuing non-compliance. An example of this would be if the data is lost or stolen. This is something that our office would want to be aware of, and it would need to be reported to the reviewing IRB. So when UTD serves as the relying IRB, typically one of the following is true. So the reviewing IRB is an AAHRPP accredited organization or an organization seeking that accreditation. So the AAHRPP stands for the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs. Or the reviewing IRB must be registered with OHRP, which is the Office for Human Research Protections, and the institution must have an FWA, a federal-wide assurance. All of these items mentioned indicate that the institution follows the ethical research standards for the protection of human subjects in research. So we want to ensure that if we're relying on another institution, they follow the same or similar protections for their participants. The UTD investigator must be a collaborator on human subjects research primarily conducted at another institution, and the UTD investigator's role does not include interaction or intervention with subjects. So an example of this might be when another institution is collecting the data and the UTD investigator will receive de-identified data for analysis purposes. So they're not actually interacting with the participants, but they are obtaining de-identified data and analyzing it, so they are engaged in the research. Another example is if UTD is engaged in the research solely because we are the prime awardee. UTD investigators will not interact with the participants, they're not conducting the consent process, and they're not obtaining identifiable information. So these are the situations where UTD usually will agree to serve as the relying IRB. When we are the relying IRB, the following is required. So all UTD affiliated study personnel must complete the required human subjects protection training. And this documentation must be submitted along with an application via our Cayuse IRB electronic submission portal to our office. The application should include the approved study materials by the reviewing IRB, so a copy of their application or protocol, consent forms, local context form if that's required, and their approval letter. As we've mentioned, even if UTD serves as the relying institution, we are still responsible to ensure the protection of the rights and welfare of participants in human subjects research. So we still need to ensure that our investigators are trained and they have completed that training and that we have documentation of that. When you submit via Cayuse, you will select the IRB Reliance. UTD is not the IRB of record option. So if we are the reviewing IRB, then you will not select this. But if we are relying on another institution, you'll select this option and it will ask you questions specific to that. So it will not ask you the same amount or same detail as the other application because we are just relying and we are interested in the UTD part of the study rather than the study as a whole. So when UTD serves as the relying IRB, what are the UTD investigators' responsibilities after approval? You should know the policies of the reviewing IRB and adhere to the approved protocol. That includes modifications. So if the study has been modified and it's changing the protocol or the data storage to consent form, anything, you need to be aware of that because the reviewing IRB is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the research, and you should be ensured that you are following what they have approved. Report any conflict of interest, COI changes, to the UTD IRB office. An example of this would be if a new device is added to a study and you are affiliated with the company that owns the device. This is information that the UTD COI office would want to know. And also participating in post-approval monitoring. That involves the efforts of both IRBs. So post-approval monitoring, the purpose of this is to confirm that the research is conducted as approved. So you're using the approved study materials, you're storing the data as approved. Everything is happening just as it is. So what documentation needs to be submitted after initial approval? If we are the relying IRB, we would need the continuing review or renewal applications and approval letters. This is because our approval and expiration dates will match the IRB of record. So once the study expires for them, it will expire here as well. So you'll need to renew it at UTD as well, even if we are the relying institution. Modifications, if the modification affects UTD investigators or the research taking place at UTD sites. So if there are changes to UTD affiliated study personnel, the research that is taking place on our site, or if you're adding or removing a UTD site, if the consent form is being updated, if UTD investigators are involved in the consent process. Reportable events, so non-compliance, problems, when those issues take place with UTD investigators or at UTD sites. Once the study is closed at the reviewing IRB, it needs to be closed at UTD as well. So once they have closed that study, we need the closure letter, the application, any documentation that is submitted so that it can then be submitted at our office as well. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact the IRB office.
Thank you for your time and resources, Mary Beth and Amanda. And audience, thank you for joining us today. Everyone, have a great afternoon.